In 1958, the Chinese Communist Party declared war against birds. That's right, they declared war against birds and sparrows in particular. Now, the reason they did this was because as the Great Leap Forward was going on, the people of China started to notice that birds and sparrows were eating some of the seeds and some of the farming products that were being produced, and ultimately this was limiting the amount of output that could be produced. So if you listen to the previous two episodes, we know that there was this obsession with quantity over quality in China during the Great Leap Forward. So there was an intense drive to produce more and more food, more and more numbers, more and more stuff, and this would please Mao and the Communist Politburo, basically. So once the party noticed that birds were one of the culprits that could possibly be a reason why they weren't producing as much as they should, they declared all-out war. So they demanded that the people of China spend all hours of the day outside banging pots and pans, going up with ladders into dangerous areas and destroying nests, using slingshots to shoot birds out of the sky. And eventually, as people did this over and over and over again throughout the day, the birds would just continue flying and then ultimately die of exhaustion. People would leave poison bait out, and this bait would be eaten by sparrows, and ultimately they would die. Other times they would just shoot them out of the air, like we said, with slingshots. And by 1960, a huge amount of these sparrows and birds are now gone from China, to the point where they're almost extinct. Unfortunately, also by 1960, the geniuses at the top of the Great Leap Forward suddenly realized that birds also eat insects. Oops. So insect infestations now nearly doubled, and it's seen that around 10 to 15% of crop fields in certain areas of China were now completely infested with insects. This lack of foresight and this lack of any sort of coherent and logical plan to solve any problem is something that is key to understand with the Great Leap Forward. It's almost as if they tried to fix one problem, and then by doing that in a way that was completely inefficient and ineffective, they created 3 or 4 more problems. So if you listen to the previous 2 episodes on the Great Leap Forward that we did, you know that agriculture was a mess, as these irrigation schemes and new farming practices that hadn't been proven were all of a sudden being deployed, and this was resulting in famine, hunger, and ultimately the death of millions and millions of people. Another thing that was impacted was simply the industry of China. I mean, literally everything that was produced was of inferior quality. This was due to neglect, lack of incentive by the workers, just waste. So any sort of cement, tools, railroad lines, consumer goods, all of this stuff was just essentially useless. I mean, imagine living in a society where it's just a broken world. Okay, nothing works. Nothing is as effective as it could or should be. And that's not to mention anything about the lives of the people who went through this. I mean, life in a factory in China during the Great Leap Forward was an absolute horror show. People were packed in like sardines into facilities that were designed to hold 5 or 6 times less people. There was no adequate working conditions. There was no properly working bathrooms. People just had to go on the floor or in newspapers, which they would throw out the window of the nearest room. Oftentimes people would have to live and sleep in rooms filled with hundreds of people, and ultimately they would have no space to do anything that would resemble a healthy lifestyle. Illness and disease would spread wildly, and as we said, millions of people would be affected by this. In addition to the agriculture and the industry problems, there was a massive housing crisis. And when we think of housing crisis today, it's nothing like what the people in China were going through. One of the most amazing stats in all of the Great Leap Forward is that by 1962, 40% of all the houses in China had been turned into rubble. Okay, so think about that for a second. That is probably the greatest destruction of human property in the history of humanity. This left people homeless. This left people without anywhere to go or any shelter from the elements. This would contribute to the starvation conditions, and ultimately it would contribute to the just total disaster that the Great Leap Forward was. It also has to be mentioned the amount of destruction to the natural environment and just Mother Nature that happened during the Great Leap Forward. There was huge amounts of deforestation. Mao himself would say, quote, "We should open fire on nature," end quote. And he really meant it. You also have to consider those huge irrigation projects that we mentioned in the previous episodes. And these things often were left undone or poorly done because it turns out that, people just being worked to death and pulled out of their houses and homes and forced to work in these projects might not be producing the highest quality reservoirs and dams and irrigation tunnels. Ultimately, when it started raining, these things could turn into just huge mudslides or devastating dam collapses that could wipe away entire peoples and towns and villages. And this isn't just during the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1962. This would continue to affect China for decades. Listen to this story. Talks about one of these dams collapsing almost 2 decades later in 1980. Quote, "When a typhoon hit the region in August 1975, these dams broke, unleashing a tidal wave which drowned an estimated 230,000 people. By 1980, some 2,976 dams had collapsed in Henan. As the chief of the Provincial Bureau for Water Resources later put it, referring to the Great Leap Forward, the crap from that era has not yet been cleared up," end quote. So you see the extent to which not only is the Great Leap Forward destroying the lives of the people in China as it's happening, but it's also literally and kind of symbolically destroying and impacting lives for decades after it's over. And if you haven't listened to the previous episodes we've done on this topic and you're wondering to yourself, how could human life be toyed with in such a ridiculously ineffective and inefficient manner, then welcome to the Great Leap Forward. We've already talked about some of the basics of the Great Leap Forward, both in this episode and in the previous 2 episodes of the trilogy, so we kind of have an understanding of the where, the why, the how, all that stuff. So in this episode, at least for the rest of this episode, we're really going to focus on kind of how did each individual person survive this horrible thing. So how did the kind of average Joe in China, particularly in rural China where it was hit the hardest, how did they go about surviving and how did they go about just making it through this horrific event? According to Frank Decatur, who wrote a book about the Great Leap Forward, it's called Mao's Great Famine, and I believe we actually quoted it earlier in the show, and it's definitely a good book. I recommend anyone who wants to learn more about the Great Leap Forward pick that up and give it a read. Basically what he says about this human survival thing is, quote, "As famine developed, the survival of an ordinary person came increasingly to depend on the ability to lie, charm, hide, steal, cheat, pilfer, forge, smuggle, slack, trick, manipulate, or otherwise outwit the state," end quote. So basically what he's saying there is, as the desperation and the famine and the hunger started spreading, your ability to kind of create a black market for yourself and your community would ultimately be what determined your survival in a lot of these cases. As this black market developed, anything from bricks to clothes, fuel, wood, anything was bartered for food, essentially to keep yourself alive. Even blood was sold, oftentimes in rural areas of China. Now, one of the reasons for this was in the communist state, there really wasn't any need or use for money. So the Communist Party would shell out a certain amount of funds for the amount of work that people were doing, but oftentimes it wasn't enough, and it certainly wasn't enough to buy food for you and your family. Instead, food was supposed to be distributed in the communes along with all the other necessities of life. The problem was that because of the famine and because of the inefficiencies of the system, there just wasn't enough food to go around. So people kind of had to barter for their lives, essentially. Probably the most extreme example of this black market that developed was families and mothers selling their babies in order to get food to continue to survive. Listen to this anecdote from historian Frank Decatur again. Quote, Wu Jingxi got 5 yuan for his 9-year-old son from a stranger, a sum which covered the cost of a bowl of rice and 2 kilos of peanuts. His heartbroken wife, an inquiry discovered, cried so much that her swollen eyes were losing their vision. Wang Wei-tong, mother of 2, sold one of her sons for 1.5 yuan and 4 steamed dough buns. End quote. Wow. So it's really difficult to imagine being in a situation like that where you are so desperate and so hungry and the situation is just so insane that you're even willing to entertain the thought of selling off your children. And it really just goes to show how terrible the Great Leap Forward was and what kind of impact it had on the people of China. So for better or for worse, that was kind of one way that the Chinese people were able to survive, was to partake in that black market that we just talked about. Another mode of survival was apathy. So we think of apathy now as kind of a negative trait. This is when someone is lazy or they just don't care or they're not doing enough work to be productive, things along those lines. But in China during the Great Leap Forward, apathy could save your life, okay? Because you literally had to save energy in order to avoid being worked to death. When food was as scarce as it was and the labor was as intense as it was, if you were someone who was gung-ho about the Great Leap Forward and you were going out and you were working your butt off for, as we said, 18, 19, 20 hours a day, and you weren't supplementing that with calories, chances were you were going to starve yourself to death. So if you were just kind of an average Joe in China, you kind of had to pick your battles here. You didn't want to work yourself to death. And really, when you think about it, you can add on to this the fact that there's really no incentive to work hard. You don't gain anything from doing extra work or putting in more effort. In this communist system, the only thing that's getting you is a quicker trip to the grave. So all of this apathy that is in part due to a lack of incentive and in part due to just trying to survive is going to lead to, on the large scale, a inefficiency of the overall system. In particular, farming would not produce enough food as it could or should, and ultimately this is just passing the buck of starvation and death down to the distant peasants and the distant people in cities who were relying on that food. So yes, this kind of apathy could save your life and the life of your family, but not producing what you were supposed to produce, sadly, is going to end up killing more people down the line, if that makes any sense. And it is important to mention that there was essentially no justice system. So essentially the entire justice system that existed in China previously was abolished, and basically justice was left up to the whims of the local cadre and then, his boss and so on up the line until eventually you got to Mao. So any complaints or any idea of trying to get some sort of legitimate justice going during these atrocities that are happening during the Great Leap Forward, all that's going to do is end up labeling you a quote-unquote rightist. And of course, you don't want to be labeled a rightist because that could lead to the penal camps or torture or beatings or worse. So if you didn't like it, really the only thing you could do was kind of wheel and deal and just try and survive the best you could. Going along with this idea, stealing and theft became common on all levels, and this led to violence, chaos, and all sorts of disputes. On the individual level, many made the simple decision to just steal food as they were kind of farming it, or maybe prematurely before it was ready to be, shipped off to wherever it was supposed to go. and sometimes this would be enough to save you and your family, and many would just risk, whatever the penalties would be in order to steal a little bit here, a little bit there, in order to continue to survive. There actually were large-scale armed raids on granaries, railroads, things like this. Some were relatively successful. Most were crushed absolutely brutally. And there was kind of places on the outskirts of China where there was a little bit of a threat to security in the region, but ultimately there was no significant threat to the government. Mao had already successfully purged most of the military of any kind of, quote-unquote rightist sympathies. So in order to succeed in that kind of large-scale rebellion, you really do need the support of the military. Now, ultimately, the most effective strategy of survival during the Great Leap Forward was to get the hell out of rural China. This is where those large-scale irrigation projects were happening that were claiming millions of lives. This is where those communes and farming villages were popping up with their inane farming practices that led to starvation and death. This is where backyard furnaces were, being thrown up and people's houses were being torn down to feed the steel inferno. Ultimately, if you wanted to survive, you had a better chance of leaving the village and going to the city and attempting to survive there. So many did move to the city and just try their luck, trying to find a job in the city's underbelly. So they had the black market opportunities, you could find odd jobs, many even unfortunately turned to the sex trade. But moving from the countryside to the city was dangerous. So China had set up what's called dissuasion stations, and anyone trying to flee the countryside for a better life in the city could be detained at one of these stations, beaten, tortured, and essentially imprisoned for countless numbers of years. There were about 600 of these dissuasion stations all throughout China, and the sole purpose was to prevent people from leaving the countryside and moving to the city. Because again, this would affect the bottom line, and in a system where quantity matters more than quality, this makes total sense. Ultimately, throughout the Great Leap Forward, you had tens of thousands of refugees trying to cross the borders of China into the northern areas of the Soviet Union, to the south, trying to get into Vietnam, trying to get to areas west of China, and most prominently, trying to get into Western-controlled Hong Kong, of course, which was controlled by Great Britain. For the most part, these refugees were almost always turned away and forced to return to the horror show that was China at the time. The United Nations was really unwilling and unable to do anything about this, and this is one of the many, many examples where people will point to and say the United Nations is kind of a joke. I mean, the whole point of the United Nations is supposedly to prevent stuff like this from happening, and when it does, to be able to help people in need. So check this out. The official line from the United Nations was that they didn't recognize China as a country, okay? Because remember, they recognized the official China as Taiwan. They weren't recognizing the Communist government of China as a legitimate government. So if there's no China as a country, then there can't possibly be any refugees from China. So therefore, they couldn't provide any significant aid. Okay, so this is classic United Nations, and again, just one of those examples where it seems like they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth. And just another example in the long line of criticisms that people have of the United Nations. The United States and other Western countries were happy to stick by their immigration quotas, and probably one of the most intense and devastating humanitarian crises of all time goes without any significant international aid for refugees and the people who needed the help. Sound familiar? In a system where the quantity of output matters more than the individual well-being of the individual person, there were three groups during the Great Leap Forward that got hit particularly hard. The first group was children, then women, and then the elderly. The reason for this is that the value in this communist system was placed on able-bodied workers. Okay, so the strong men and the people who could go out, and sometimes this was women and children too, but anyone who could go out and work, produce, was going to have more value than, people who are old or sick or young, etc. So this led to some really unfortunate marginalization for these groups that I just mentioned. Children that were too young to work or go to school were often sent to kind of communal daycares. And here they were separated from their families while their parents were out digging ditches or working in the backyard furnaces. Oftentimes these kids would just be in these huge daycare centers where there really wasn't anyone watching them. Lax care would lead to infections. Corporal punishment was used. And of course, the scars of this would last for a lifetime. Any kid who was old enough would often work in the fields with their parents. The problem was that these children obviously aren't able-bodied workers, and they aren't able to endure some of the harsh, beatings and the harsh work that they had to do, so the death rates for children were especially high. There are anecdotes of kids being beaten to death, tortured, drowned like dogs. It was truly not easy to be a kid during the Great Leap Forward. One of the craziest stories I came across was about a little 8-year-old girl who her entire family falls ill, or they're just exhausted from work and they're unable to leave the house, and she has to go out, walk for a few miles to the local commune and kind of jostle and cajole her way to the front of the food lines. All the while she's being bullied and kind of pushed aside by adults who are trying to survive also, and she's fighting for one bowl of porridge that she's going to bring back to her family, and this is how they're going to survive. So one day on her way home, she falls down and spills the bowl of porridge, and you have to remember that this could be the difference between life and death for her family. Okay, that's how desperate the situation was. And here's how she describes it. Quote, "I cried, but then I remembered that my parents and the whole family were still waiting for me to bring the food back for them to eat. So I picked myself up and scraped the food up from the ground. It was full of sand. But in the end, they ate the food slowly because it was full of sand. If they did not eat it, they would be so hungry that they might go crazy." End quote. So that's one of the most amazing stories of survival that I came across when researching the Great Leap Forward, but it also highlights the extent to which it wasn't just the dead who ended up suffering. Okay, even if you survived, this Great Leap Forward would have a major psychological impact on you. So I can't even imagine, the pressure and the burden that an 8-year-old girl feels as she goes out and tries to provide for her family as they're basically crumbling and disintegrating all around her. It's really just unbelievable to even think about. Another sad phenomenon that happened during the Great Leap Forward was something called losing a child. So basically what losing a child was when parents or guardians would just abandon a kid on the side of the road basically because they couldn't support them or in order to save themselves. So again, when there's only a certain amount of rations to go around, a lot of times families couldn't feed everybody. They just couldn't do it. So oftentimes as families would go on these long marches to, the irrigation tunnels or whatever, they would just leave kids by the side of the road, just lose the child. Sometimes this was just to save themselves, which is, sad and depressing to think about, but sometimes it was actually to give them a better chance to survive. So oftentimes parents would leave 2 kids on the side of the road and just let them try and support themselves. So a lot of people did the calculation that them trying to survive on their own would be a better chance of survival than continuing to live in this commune. So ultimately it would not be uncommon to see roving bands of orphans kind of roaming the countryside, stealing and pilfering in order to survive. Clearly life was tough for children, but it was also probably just as tough for women during the Great Leap Forward. So if we remember that communism was actually supposed to liberate women, it was supposed to give them more rights, more equality, more freedoms. And ironically, of course, this is not anywhere close to being what actually happened, at least in China during the Great Leap Forward. Women were forced to work in the fields, even if they were pregnant or sick. They were often humiliated and objectified if they were unable to meet the numbers that some of their male counterparts were putting up in the fields or the factories or the furnaces or whatever. Oftentimes, on top of this work in the fields and the furnaces, they were expected to deal with childcare as well, which could obviously be a huge burden, as we already talked about. Rapes by corrupt cadres and local officials were not uncommon. I read stories of entire factories of women that were forced to work naked in order to kind of humiliate and objectify them. Any women who stole in order to survive were sometimes punished by being humiliated in these naked parades, where they would kind of be forced to go through the village in what must have been just an unthinkable mental trauma. Think Cersei Lannister in Game of Thrones, if anyone reads that or watches that. On top of this, you can add that men were often expected to get the lion's share of the food rations because they were seen as the primary workers and the ones who were most likely to increase the bottom line of productivity. Not only were conditions for women worse, but they often weren't even getting as much food or rations as the men, and this was decreasing their ability to survive at the end of the day. The last group that really got hit hard by the Great Leap Forward, besides women and children, was the elderly. So when famine is raging and the moral fabric of society is already breaking down, why take care of the elderly? Listen to one of the cooks in the Hengyang region talking to one of the elderly, quote, "What point is there in feeding you? If we feed the pigs, at least we will get some meat," end quote. So it's important to note that even though there was a lack of food, there was some food in each commune, and the local cadres would have to decide how to distribute that food. So when you're confronted with shortages, you often have to make tough decisions. And when the value of a human is based on what kind of output they produce, it actually makes sense to limit food for the elderly, limit food for children, limit food for women. Okay, this is the society you get when quantity of output matters more than quality of life. So again, in these desperate conditions, in this famine environment, oftentimes it was women, children, and the elderly who got the short end of the stick. And going along with this idea that life was cheap during the Great Leap Forward, here's Foreign Minister Chen Yi on all of the industrial and agricultural accidents that happened. Quote, "It's nothing," end quote. So there was this idea in China, and it was led by Mao Zedong, and the idea was 1 finger in 10. So all of the bad things that happened during the Great Leap Forward, the deaths, the murders, the beatings, the failures, all of this was just 1 finger in 10. The other 9 fingers were good. Unfortunately, this was just completely not true. I mean, there was industrial accidents, fires, gas explosions, starvation, coal mining incidents, building cave-ins due to shoddy steel production, transportation accidents. I mean, these accidents occurred all the time with overworked and tired workers, and they led to injuries and death all the time. What's important to note is that even a minor injury during this crazy Great Leap Forward production environment could lead to missing a day of work, and this could lead to missing a day of food rations, and this could lead to starving to death before too long. So even minor injuries, minor accidents, minor incidents could lead to a vicious cycle of working yourself to death. In addition to death from accidents, there was also death from disease. So there didn't seem to be any massive epidemics of anything, but you had a combination of all sorts of different illnesses and diseases, from typhus to cholera to smallpox, dysentery, malaria, schistosomiasis. Okay, most of this was caused by overcrowding and a lack of proper nutrition. I mean, there's stories of people literally turning purple because of a lack of a varied diet due to the famine. In places where the famine hit particularly hard, people were forced to eat mud and straw roofs and all sorts of things that, obviously you wouldn't eat at first glance, but they had no choice. Here's a story of a girl talking about what she ate when she was essentially tortured by hunger. Quote, "I was still quite young then. I was very hungry, so I broke a piece of maize stalk used to cover the roof and began to chew it. It tasted delicious. I chewed one piece after another. I was so hungry that even maize stalks tasted good." End quote. You have people that are wildly malnourished, and then you add to this the overcrowding and the lack of sanitation in most of the people's communes, and you have a recipe for disaster. Here's a description of one of the communes. Quote, "Chicken excrement was everywhere. Human feces have piled up, ditches are blocked, and the stench is overwhelming." End quote. So of course this is going to lead to food poisoning and disease and all sorts of just physical maladies. And we haven't even mentioned the mental illness that is obvious when you're talking about conditions this desperate and this poor. Anyone who spoke out against these horrifying conditions or offered any sort of alternative solutions would often be sent to what were called reform camps or re-education camps. At these labor camps, people were forced to work for the Communist Party. Many of them were tortured, many simply executed. In fact, the number of executions was just another number to be met, just like any of the other numbers as far as, output of agriculture or industrial output. There was an execution number as well. It's difficult to analyze the exact numbers of how many people died in these labor camps, but there's estimates ranging from 1 million to 6 million or even higher, the amount of people who died in these labor camps working themselves to death. And this is really one aspect of the Great Leap Forward that really needs to be emphasized is simply the violence. In a world where there's no incentive to work, violence became the primary motivator. As one party member said, quote, "If you want to be a party member, you must know how to beat people." End quote. This was his advice to anyone trying to run a commune. So over the course of the Great Leap Forward, millions of people would be either beaten, tortured, lit on fire, branded, had boiling water poured on them. In especially horrifying cases, I read about feces and urine being poured down people's throats. It's estimated that about 2.5 million people died of this type of violence during the Great Leap Forward. One common method of violence and torture was saltwater injections. And when I came across this, I had to verify this, in a variety of different ways because I just simply couldn't believe it. And everything I read does seem to verify that you could be tortured with bamboo needles and shot up with salt water, which, I can't even imagine the amount of pain and suffering that would lead to. The society was militarized, so there were what was called beating squads who kind of carried weapons around with them, going from commune to commune, essentially beating anyone who showed any sort of disagreement with the Great Leap Forward or any alternative positions. The local militia would seal up people's homes so that workers couldn't go home. They had to continue working in the fields and in the furnaces. So there was definitely an element of violence, and it played a huge role in the Great Leap Forward. Not to mention the 1 to 3 million suicides, a huge number due to pain and illness, but possibly also a huge number due to shame and humiliation from dealing with this violence and maybe even inflicting violence on your comrades, your family members, your friends. It also needs to be noted that it was probably not widespread, but there were definitely police reports and cases of cannibalism that were documented during the Great Leap Forward. And it's not like this is completely out of the ordinary. This is a desperation survival technique. So it's really not surprising to read that people would often dig up graves or resort to cannibalism in order to survive. I didn't read any sort of historical analysis that talks about the benefits of the Great Leap Forward because there doesn't seem to be any really at all. But in case there's some sort of, revisionist history about this in the future, I mean, it's bad when people are digging up corpses for dinner. So, end of analysis as far as the Great Leap Forward goes. I don't see how anyone could see this and then support any sort of benefits from the Great Leap Forward. Ultimately, the final numbers are unreliable because the people keeping them are ultimately the Chinese Communist Party. And we've already seen how they can make numbers seem legitimate or fudge numbers in certain cases. So most historians, based on the evidence that they compiled through the archives in Communist China, as well as, population experts, these types of things, historians, estimate that it's between 20 and 50 million people who died during the Great Leap Forward. Most historians seem to lean towards the higher number there, and the number I seem to go along with is about 45 million people would die as a result of the Great Leap Forward. If that number is correct, 45 million people dying in 4 years' time, I can't really think of another kind of humanitarian assault or any sort of crisis where the numbers are that bad for that short an amount of time. So to me, it's obvious that the Great Leap Forward was obviously one of the most horrifying events in all of world history. And to me, it's also a little bit sad that probably not a lot of people know a whole lot about it. So I hope that you learned something about the Great Leap Forward, and I hope that you took some lessons from it that you can apply to your own lives as well as your own times and what's going on in the world today. For me, there's a lot of lessons to take from the Great Leap Forward, but one in particular that stood out for me was there seems to be a lot of debate in the modern day about different political ideologies and, what's the right way to do things and this sort of thing. Well, if you look at the Great Leap Forward, it seems that at a certain point, you just have to accept a sort of Lockean view of natural rights and the individual not being interfered with as kind of the base level of everything else you build an ideology on top of. So you kind of just have to accept the basic value of a human life. And if you don't, and just go for more of a ends justify the means mentality, history tells us that the Great Leap Forward, or something like it, is what you're going to get. If you like this episode of the podcast, or any of the previous episodes, you can leave a rating or review on whatever platform you're listening to it on. I'm told this helps spread the podcast to people who might be interested in listening to it somehow. So that would be fantastic if you could do that. If you didn't like the episode, you can leave me an angry tweet and we can talk about why it was terrible. Ultimately, I'm just glad you're out there listening. So that being said, thanks for listening.